In a way, success is its own worst enemy. You can make a game of such ridiculously high quality, raking in the awards and the accolades, but it also sets such a high standard if you ever want to make a sequel. And a lot of the time, the second game falls way short.
To be a video game developer. No matter what you achieve in the first game, no matter how many 10 out of 10 scores you have thrown at you, there isn't a damn thing that can save you if the sequel ends up being a step down. Admittedly, there's variations on this, just how much worse the sequel is, or even the possibility, and hey, it happens quite a lot, that the second game is actually better. But there's an awful lot of cases where a combination of believing that reputation will do more to sell a game than quality, and good old-fashioned complacency produce a game that doesn't even remotely meet what might well be massive expectations. Making a sequel isn't easy, trying to strike a balance between new stuff and not fixing what isn't broken, to the extent where you really have to hand it to games that get it right. But the stories of disappointing, second-rate, vastly underwhelming follow-ups are a lot more common than you'd think. Time to put a cork on those expectations. When you ask most people about their experience of Castlevania on the NES, they'll usually come out with, oh god, this is so fucking holy sh... Exactly. In order to get some decent playtime out of a game back in the NES era, developers made games unforgiving, ruthless, a real challenge for you to fight through, making you feel like you've got your money's worth. Castlevania wasn't easy, but it sure kept you occupied until the controller ended up through a window. And then they made a sequel and slowed everything down. So how about this for a trade-off? You can either have a ball-bustingly difficult game that will have you swearing like you got a paper cut between your toes, or you can play a more RPG-based action game where farming and grinding add hours upon hours onto the playtime. I guess it really is up to what you enjoy in a game, but Castlevania 2 is just so much slower in almost every aspect. I mean, it's nice to be out of all these corridors with fucking Medusa heads killing you every fucking time, but replacing it with lifeless towns and forced grinding for hearts so you can pay for the next item to get you to the next area is 100% not the way to do it.
There are many different ways to artificially lengthen a video game. You can make it difficult, you can add some kind of downloadable content, or you can even just add multiplayer. That's quite good, that's quite a good way of doing it. But if you want to really annoy people, you can just make everything take longer. The whole journey through this game just takes longer. And I'm sorry, if you want to keep people engaged, that's not the way to do it. It feels more like a slog and less like an adventure.
So the year is 1999 and a group of developers are looking for a way to revitalise the Resident Evil series. Nothing really wrong with it, but you can't afford for things to get too stagnant. And by accident they managed to kickstart one of the more stylised action series out there, with one of the funniest protagonists you'll ever see. On the one hand, the link between Devil May Cry and Resident Evil isn't all that obvious, but you know, fixed cameras, shitty voice acting, effectively separate at birth.
You can understand with the first game that there would be some rough edges, especially when you consider it started as a Resident Evil game, but now you've understood what works and what doesn't, you can make the sequel from the ground up. You can take advantage of all the good things the first game did right. Sounds simple, doesn't it?
Devil May Cry 2 is such a drab game, to the extent where I just struggle to find the right words to describe just how dull it is. You know Dante, that suave, stylish main character who gamers fell in love with? Well, now he's all mopey and brooding over all kinds of things that don't actually matter. It's like they took that scene near the end of the first game where his voice breaks and decided they want to see more caring from Dante and yet a fuckload less expression. But even putting Dante to one side, this game is awkwardly easy. What made Devil May Cry such an exciting prospect wasn't its difficulty. It's how thrilling the combat was, having to keep yourself on top of the enemy in what are really cramped locations. Devil May Cry is just too laid back. Enemies barely put up a fight and there's way too much space. Both in battle where you back up and just shoot the thing, and out of battle where you spend so long running around doing absolutely fuck all. I mean, come on guys, how can you get it that wrong? Needed more laughing in the face of being stabbed in the chest.
Have you ever seen those parody trailers or pictures where someone decides to take a realistic approach on something that should never be taken realistically? Like how Mario is effectively going around taking drugs and beating up lizards. But what if you were actually to make that game, not the Mario thing, just in general, taking a cartoony style, cartoony premise, and making it more realistic?
Because you take one look at the thrills of a game of Bomberman and think this is just perfect for some kind of realistic reimagining with darker themes and some sort of dystopian future. No? Just me? Oh, okay, but I'm still making the game anyway. Bomberman Act Zero, everybody. The answer to a question that quite literally no one was asking or even pondered at any point in their life. No one cares what Bomberman would look like if it was a featureless, generic action game. The fact that the previous games featured a cheery main character who would then go about blowing up anyone in his way was at least half the reason why you'd play it. Act Zero decides it can replace charm with realism, and of course, it blows up in its face. And before we get bogged down a little too much talking about how this game is different and therefore bad, it's a terrible game by its own merits. This was in 2006 on the Xbox 360, and yet it looks, sounds, and indeed plays like a low-budget GameCube game. I could maybe forgive the premise if they put some effort into it, but everything about this game is just so uninspired. Except maybe the decision to release it as a full game and at full price. Not a mad experiment consigned to the darkest reaches of XBLA. Means you make more money when people accidentally buy it, thinking it's gonna be a good Bomberman game. Those evil bastards. So let's just head back to 1999 where we still haven't resolved the whole Resident Evil problem. The solution ended up being a bit of a departure from the traditional horror game. Suddenly the protagonist got loads of guns and a free moving camera. Resident Evil 4 is still a fantastic game that provided a template for dozens of games that followed in the next decade or so, but it did leave its origins behind a little. Come the sequel and it's more of the same, but perhaps unsurprisingly a little mediocre in comparison. I mean, Resident Evil 5 has a lot of problems and it was never going to be a match for Resi 4, but at least it functions for the most part. Don't worry, we've got far bigger and far more rotten fish to fry.
The disappointment between Resident Evil 4 and 5 is one thing. You could perhaps expect it given the magnitude of Resident Evil 4, and Resident Evil 5 did some things differently, but most of them it didn't really need to. But the gap and the disappointment levels between Resident Evil 5 and Resident Evil 6 is something ever so slightly more insulting.
Oh my god, what the hell is this game? You can accuse the Resident Evil games of being many things and criticise many teeny tiny aspects of them, but they were almost never boring. You were either having the shit scared out of you or having to mow down waves of rampant zombie bad guys. Neither of which can really be attributed to being all that boring. Resident Evil 6 makes the fatal mistake of destroying any remnants of horror. Resident Evil 4 and 5 diluted it down a bit, but the 6th game becomes this tedious third-person shooter. Perhaps the only reason why you would play it is because of the fan-fiction style storyline, where some of the series' finest characters come together to solve the problem at hand, through a series of different campaigns. It's as bittersweet as it could possibly be. Kind of a, the gang's all here, but my god, why did you have to meet up here? In a game that virtually pratfalls into mediocrity, and for a series as outlandish as Resident Evil, you wonder how it can bounce back from it.
Expectations are really powerful. They can be a good thing, because they can help fuel the initial sales before the game actually comes out, but if they spiral out of control, quite often the end product ends up being nowhere near good enough to meet the expectations of the fans, and they treat it harshly as a result. Or, it could just be really terrible on its own.
When the development of your video game is so complicated that it has its own page on Wikipedia, not like a paragraph like most other games, an entire essay dedicated to the drama that unfolded during 15 years of utter chaos, spanning numerous different developers, delays, and even a lawsuit, you can just tell that Duke Nukem Forever is not going to be a good game. Right up until it was confirmed to be released, it was thought that it would be the game that everyone wanted, but one that never happened. Sadly it did, and everyone wished it had stayed a pipe dream. Duke, listen buddy, back in 1996 this was all fine. You could stride around blowing up aliens, spouting hilarious one-liners, and being the edgy protagonist that few could come close to. This is around the time of Doom, which was along the same kind of lines but with less personality. You can look back at both games and see how far FPS games have come, but when you eventually, huge fucking emphasis on eventually, make a sequel, you've got to take that into account. You can't just have the same kind of game and expect people to look at it in the same way. Gaming's moved on massively since then, and sadly, it looks like Duke Nukem Forever is still living in the late 90s. And then there's a really tragic thing. The charm, the character of the first 3 games is dead in the water in Duke Nukem Forever. In a way, Duke's appeal papered over any cracks that the older games might have had. You didn't really mind because Duke was being awesome and it all felt very manly. 15 years later and Duke Nukem Forever just isn't very funny. It's like seeing a classic rock band get back together for a comeback tour, except they're all overweight and can't sing anymore. The game stopped being charismatic and went for flat out offensive, and I'm sorry. One way or another, you just can't get away with that nowadays. In between incredibly dated graphics and animations, hugely lengthy loading screens, and ridiculously linear gameplay, it ends up reading like a gaming development blacklist.
This has been RabbidLuigi, and satire can only get you so far. It's all fun and games, but you gotta remember that people are paying actual money to play this. They have standards that they expect this genre to comply with. In the end, Duke Nukem Forever concentrated so much on parodying various parts of gaming and modern society that it actually became a parody of what it used to be.
Want to have a say on what I talk about next week? Leave a top 5 suggestion in the comments section below and go follow me on Twitter, where later in the week I'll be compiling the best submissions and setting up a vote over there. Thanks for watching guys, and I'll see you in the next one. Hey guys, hope you enjoyed that. Interestingly, the thing I was supposed to be doing last week, which meant I didn't have time to make a top 5, didn't end up happening, so I just had a bit of a week off, really. But no, I'm back now with radical new ideas and a fresh outlook on making videos, or so you'd hope. Be sure to head over to my Twitter and Facebook where stupid shit happens occasionally. I mean, you wouldn't want to be the only person to miss out on it, right?